Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank you, Zitang and Ratan, for organizing this symposium. Um, so, why build encoding models? Um, I think something that we all believe is that the predictive power of these models would tell us something about the computation that is being carried in the core part of the model, right? We have all sorts of task-optimized model for language, for vision, for other modalities. And we try to map their features to the brain and then be like, oh, if this model does better than model, it must have been the data set or the learning objective or something. And this has been very, influential way of thinking about how to go about understanding the brain. But the caveat is that not all brain computations can be captured in task-optimized model, right? There are some things that are specific about the brain, the way that certain areas interact with one another. That's not something that you would necessarily have from a model that is trained for object recognition. It also means that we need to take all these models and align them with the brain, use all the information that we have to make them more brain-aligned. Then we could interpret those models, and then we can learn something about the computation that happens in the brain. Also, as Zitang mentioned, these models can, if they're really good and generalizable, then we could use them as proxy for the brain. We could do in silico experimentation on them and figure out this stuff and kind of optimize our experimentation so we don't have to do expensive experiments so much. I'm going to try to touch on all of these in my presentation. So many of you have seen this image. It shows the hierarchy of brain areas in the ventral pathway up top, and also shows a similar hierarchy of layers within a deep neural network that is trained, let's say, for a vision task. What's common is people take representation from different layers and map them to the activation of different brain areas. What's common to do is that we could take this 3D representation of the model, which has height, width, and a channel dimension, you flatten it, and then you learn a linear regression to the brain activity. But that's not very smart because you could see that there is a similar organization in the feature representation and in the brain. So a smarter way to do this, and people have proposed, is to use something called a spatial feature factorized model. In this case, you're saying, if I want to predict a unit, let me first find out where the receptive field of that unit are. Then I could just average the activity within that receptive field, then linearly map that to the activity of the unit. That way, you do not have to flatten the entire core representation, and you don't lose the spatial information that would have been valuable. At the same time, it cuts down on the number of trainable parameters significantly. However, something like this would work for units that have fixed receptive field. Where do you find those? Well, you find them in early visual areas like V1, V2, V4. But what if we go higher up and you have, for example, units in face areas that have spatial invariance? They're responding to faces in the large areas of the visual field. How does the brain implement that, right? That's a question that we're asking. But before that, before thinking about what's the right mapping from the retinotopic features to those spatially invariant units, we have to first find the right kind of features. What are the features that we're going to map? Well, in this work, we have ablations for different experiments, but we focus on transformer family of models. This shows a schematic. I'll briefly describe it if you don't know what transformers are. You basically take an image, you divide it into patches, then you encode individual patches into a vector representation. Those vectors self-attend to each other, and then eventually after multiple layers, you get encoding for different patches. It's a representation, it's a vector. You could either train a network for classification, or you could train it self-supervised, for example, distillation. When you train these models for distillation, you see an interesting representation emerge. In this case, I'm taking, for example, the representation of this patch and doing a dot product, a cosine similarity with the representation of all the other patches. These are different vectors. And you see a somewhat object-centric representation emerge. This is because these networks learn that, well, the best way to represent this patch is to make it similar to all the other patches that are on the same object. But it also tells you that in that patch representation space, faces cluster in some areas, bodies cluster in some other areas. It has a structure to it that could be exploited, and that becomes important. And I think, in a way, this is the way that these networks solve the binding problem. This is not the binding session, but this is probably the right way to think about how it would emerge in a system. So back to the problem that we want to solve. So we have these feature representations from a transformer. This is a schematic. In reality, this is 31 by 31 tokens, and each of them is around 768 in the base model. How do we map these features to, for example, predict the units in occipital face area in the right hemisphere? Well, you would say, I want the receptive field of that area to be on the parts of the image that are important for predicting occipital face area. So you probably want something like this. You want to basically have attention weights on face parts in the left hemisphere. You would combine those features, you get a single token, and then you linearly map token to the occipital face area. And this basically cuts down on the number of parameters significantly. But how do we get these content-dependent features? Well, you take the image tokens and you add positional encoding to them. These are the same number of dimensions, and then you get what we call key features. These key features for each token represent the content, but also which part of the image it came from. Now, the model would have to learn an embedding, a query, which is learning to be in a certain direction in order for the dot product of that query with this key feature to be high only in areas where faces are. And then you get an attention map similar to this. You combine only patches that have high attention maps, you get a token, and you linearly map that. This means that each area has to learn its own query because it has to learn to attend to different part of this space depending on the selectivity of the brain area. So through gradient, the model learned that, okay, if I'm going to predict occipital face area, the query should be aligned with face patches in the left hemisphere, for example. And through that, it could learn to route the right kind of information. If the face was down here, this model's attention would be down here. The information from here would have been routed to occipital face area. So you're implementing a content-dependent dynamic routing through this attention operation, transformer attention operation. We could actually learn all of these for all the regions of interest that we have in parallel. Each of them learn a query that attends to the features, and then it gives you the tokens, and those tokens would be linearly mapped to only the voxels or units in that specific brain area. We trained this network on the natural scene data set, where there are 10,000 image fMRI pairs for 8 subjects. 4 of them completed all the sessions, so we test on those. So this is just showing the overall performance of the model across different visual, body, face, and place, and word regions of interest that we have. The model performs well. When we compare this model with all the other models that are out there, our model has the fraction of parameters of a ridge regression model, as you can imagine, because the ridge regression would have to flatten that entire representation and learn a linear mapping. All these other models that people use, you could use the special token, you could use the PCA and reduced dimensionality, spatial feature factors model, or some saliency-based integration. What our model does is that because of the content-based routing, it doesn't need that many parameters, but it also doesn't lose information because it learns to route the right kind of information. So when we compare our model to the ridge regression model, we see that the model suffers in the early visual areas because here we're forcing the entire, for example, V2 dorsal to have the same receptive field, all the units there. But the units have a smaller receptive fields in that area. So one way to address this is to learn vertex-based routing. For each vertex in the brain, we learn a specific routing mechanism, so each vertex learns to route information instead of the whole RY. Now, when we look at the attention weights from different queries, we see something interesting. When we're predicting V2 dorsal in the left hemisphere, the model attends only to lower right quadrant of the image, regardless of the content. because that's what matters. When you go into higher categorical areas, you could see that the attention weights become focused on the face and different parts of the face. If there are two faces, this is in the right hemisphere, the attention is to. So it makes sense, the information that are being routed in the model makes sense, and the model learned the right kind of routing. We can also look at these ROI queries and see their relationship, because they're signatures of routing. You could see that in a way it kind of recapitulates the functional connectivity in these areas just through data-driven means. This is the paper. We have a lot more details in it. If you're interested, you could look at that. So revisiting the stuff that I said, I think the work shows that these transformer models that are trained with self-supervised objectives are good candidates of visual processing in the retinotopic areas. But also, our work suggests that there may be some sort of dynamic routing of information happening that implements these sorts of spatial invariance in the higher visual areas that you wouldn't necessarily get by just training tasks on tasks. But now let's take the next step and use our model for in silico experimentation, right? So instead of showing people the entire ImageNet of 1.3 million images, why don't we use our encoder and then test our encoder on these images rather than showing them to the subject. So we take these Schaefer parcellation, and now instead of routing for each ROI or vertex, we route for each parcel in the brain. So we learn a query for that. We get a prediction like this. It's great in the early visual areas, but there are also certain areas outside of that that are pretty good. So we were curious what they could be. So we could either select images from the test set of NST that do well, or we could generate images with a method that Andrew developed, and he helped us out a lot in this process. It's a diffusion-based model that optimizes images that, according to the encoder, maximize the activity. Or also, we could rate ImageNet images. We could just feed the entire ImageNet through our encoder and then select images that maximally activate. I'm just going to show you one area that we identified. And this area, what we saw is that these are the most activating images across subjects. And we could feed that. This is according to our encoder. We never showed this to any subjects. And when we show this to ChatGPT or GPT-4 here, it gives us an overview of what this area could be. And it goes like, oh, it's a close of a hand using a unique or unconventional tool. And it kind of agrees. We didn't know about this study, but when we looked around, we saw a meta-review that says, oh, there is a tool use area in this part of the brain. So our in silico results kind of agree with the result. But we have a bunch of more stuff that we identified in the paper, if you're interested. I'm going to present a poster on this tomorrow morning myself. So if you're interested, check that out. So I'm just going to plug a couple of other things that are related. One is that so far I only talked about encoding, but we could also use a similar approach for making decoding interpretable. So decoding is basically using fMRI activity or other brain activity to decode the image that people were looking at. So we use the same attention mechanism, and now we could look at, as the image is being denoised, which brain areas are contributing to that generation process, and to which part of the image. So if this is the input image, where people looking in the scanner, and this is what our decoder is reconstructing, it also shows you which part is being reconstructed by attending to which part of the brain is contributing to that. I can't go into details of this, but the paper is out, and also Pinyon, the first author, will be giving a talk on this in a session Tuesday morning. So if you're interested, check that out. My last slide is that we're now extending this to multimodal domain. So this is a C neuromod data set. They have videos of people watching Friends and movies, and there's a text and audio. Now we could, instead of having one modality, we have all three modalities. Now different parcels in the brain can learn to do multimodal routing, basically routing information from different modality, and then you create these multimodal tokens, which you you map linearly to the responses in that ROI. So that way we could show that which part of the multimodal input was attended for different. We also could look at the attention routing in the brain. This should be coming out soon. All right. With that, thank you and all the people that were involved in the work.
It's time for questions.
Hi, that was a really great talk. So in terms of the kind of information, the kind of insights that can be gained from these kind of models, do they always come in the form of like attention to spatial locations, or are there other ways? And like, so question one is, so what kind of information can we gain from those attention maps? And question two would be, are there other forms of information that we could acquire from this class of models?
Yeah, I feel like our focus was interpretability. So we started with attention maps and looking at what sort of areas. I think we also have linear. So it's a combination of, like a lot of the time when we think about this, is a combination of a space, which part of the space you care about, and what are the features you care about in that space, right? And I think we could interpret those things here. We look at these attention weights to see if there are other selectivities that has been overlooked, but that's a little harder to argue for compared to validating your encoder and then moving on to doing in silico experimentation the way we did it. So I feel like we still have to figure out what is the right way of like interpreting these models. At this point, I think this was a proof of concept in terms of, yes, we can do this, but that also, yes, this is the right way to build encoding models because they give you state-of-the-art while cutting down on other parameters. But I think the rest, the interpretability will come next, hopefully.
Yep. I think it's time for this one.